Before you count sheep, count mysteries.
On a quiet summer evening in Chino Hills, California, a sudden power outage sent a 60-year-old man outside his home to check the electrical panel. What happened next turned an ordinary neighborhood into the scene of a bizarre kidnapping and murder. Shukar Akber was allegedly confronted outside his home, shot, and forced into the trunk of a car. The vehicle then fled the neighborhood, with sheriff's deputies pursuing it. But the most shocking part of the story came moments later. The car was stopped. One of the suspects got out, and as deputies surrounded the vehicle, another man allegedly opened fire on Akber while he was still trapped inside the trunk. Deputies then shot the suspect, who died at the scene alongside Akber. What makes this case even stranger is that this wasn't, according to investigators, a random attack. The victim and the men accused of kidnapping him had known each other for years. They had even been connected through business. And now investigators are looking into a bitter dispute involving millions of dollars, lawsuits, and a real estate investment that may have turned a long-standing relationship into something deadly. One suspect is dead. Another is facing a murder charge. And the motive is still being investigated. So what really happened that night in Chino Hills? Why was Shukar Akber targeted? And how did a business relationship between people who had known each other for decades end with a man being kidnapped and executed inside the trunk of a car? This is the mystery of Chino Hills. On July 29th, 2026, what appeared to be an ordinary evening in the quiet California community of Chino Hills suddenly turned into a bizarre kidnapping and murder. According to investigators, 60-year-old Shukar Akber was at his home when two brothers, Zhengfeng Bo and Jianquan Bo, allegedly arrived from their home in Irvine. Prosecutors say the men confronted Akber, shot him, and forced him into the trunk of a silver Nissan Altima. The brothers then drove away, but they didn't get far. Sheriff's deputies spotted the vehicle and began pursuing it. The chase lasted for more than a mile before the car stopped on a residential street. At that moment, deputies apparently believed they were dealing with a kidnapping, but they didn't know exactly what was happening inside the vehicle. One of the brothers, Jianquan Bo, got out of the car. The other remained inside. And then everything changed. According to authorities, Zhengfeng Bo exited the vehicle and shot Akber while he was still trapped inside the trunk. Deputies immediately opened fire, killing Zhengfeng Bo at the scene. Akber was also pronounced dead. Jianquan Bo survived and was taken into custody. It was an incredibly disturbing ending to a kidnapping that had lasted only a short time. But investigators soon discovered something that made the case even stranger. This wasn't apparently a random victim. Akber and the Bo brothers had known each other for years. They had connections stretching back to China, and Akber had worked with Zhengfeng Bo in the past. They were also connected through business dealings in Southern California. So why would someone travel more than 30 miles, enter another man's neighborhood, kidnap him, and ultimately kill him? Police and prosecutors began looking into their complicated business relationship, and what they found suggested that money, property, and a bitter dispute may have played a role. But the deeper investigators looked into the relationship between these men, the stranger the story became. At first, the kidnapping looked almost impossible to understand. Why would two men drive more than 30 miles from Irvine to Chino Hills, confront a man at his home, shoot him, and then force him into the trunk of a car? Investigators soon discovered that the answer may have been connected to something much less random: business. Shukar Akber and Zhengfeng Bo had known each other through a previous working relationship. Both were connected to Pansher Incorporated, an Irvine-based commercial real estate company. Public records listed Bo as the company's chief executive officer, while Akber was listed as its chief financial officer and secretary. They weren't strangers who happened to cross paths that night. They had a history together. and that history had apparently become complicated. One of the disputes investigators are examining involves a $20 million apartment complex in Pasadena. Bo had been involved in a legal battle connected to the property, and according to his attorney, he believed he had been prevented from taking control of the investment. Akebear's name did not appear directly in the lawsuit, but Bo's attorney described him as a kind of middleman who had allegedly introduced Bo to people involved in the dispute. That doesn't prove the dispute was the reason for the killing. In fact, investigators have been careful about the motive, and authorities have not publicly established exactly why Akebear was targeted. But the existence of a major financial disagreement gives the case a possible explanation that investigators can actually investigate. And there was another strange detail. Akebear was apparently at home when the power went out. He stepped outside to check the electrical panel, and that's when the attackers allegedly approached him. Investigators are now looking into the possibility that the power outage itself was deliberately created as a ruse to lure him outside. If that theory is correct, then the attack wasn't spontaneous at all. Someone may have known where Akebear lived, known when to approach him, and created a situation that would make him leave the safety of his home. But there is still a huge gap between a business dispute and murder. A financial disagreement can lead to lawsuits. It can destroy partnerships. It can cost people millions of dollars. But why would it lead to kidnapping? Why put Akebear in the trunk? And why would Jungfeng Bo ultimately open that trunk in front of police and shoot him? The more investigators looked into the relationship between the men, the less this looked like a random act of violence. It looked personal and possibly planned. But the final moments of the kidnapping would reveal something even more disturbing. Because when deputies finally stopped the car, they had no idea that the victim was still alive inside the trunk. The entire attack appears to have been carefully coordinated. According to investigators, the power to Akebear's home was deliberately cut, creating a situation that would force him outside to check the electrical panel. When he stepped out, Jungfeng Bo and his brother Jianquan allegedly confronted him and shot him before forcing him into the trunk of a gray Nissan Altima. The motive has not been officially established. What happened next was captured in part by surveillance and became the most shocking part of the case. The car left the neighborhood and headed away from Akebear's home. Sheriff's deputies soon spotted the vehicle and began following it. The pursuit lasted roughly a mile and a half before the Nissan stopped near Gemstone Court and Wandering Ridge Drive. At that moment, deputies surrounded the vehicle. Jianquan Bo got out and surrendered, but his brother, Jungfeng, remained inside. Then, he stepped out of the driver's side. According to investigators, Jungfeng ignored commands from deputies and walked toward the back of the vehicle. He opened the trunk. Inside was Akebear, still alive, and then Jungfeng allegedly fired directly into the trunk. Deputies immediately opened fire, striking Jungfeng. Despite attempts to save them, both men were pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities have not publicly established whether Akebear died from the first gunshot at his home or from the final shot fired into the trunk. For investigators, the scene raised an obvious question. Why? If the kidnapping was motivated by money or a business dispute, why take Akebear alive in the first place? Why drive him away from his home? Why keep him in the trunk? And why, after the police had already stopped the vehicle, would Jungfeng open the trunk and shoot him again? The answers remain unclear. What investigators do know is that this wasn't a spontaneous confrontation between strangers. Akebear and Jungfeng had known each other for decades. They had met in China's Xinjiang region and later became connected through business in Southern California. People who knew them have struggled to understand how that relationship could have ended in such extreme violence. And while the police investigation was unfolding, another investigation was beginning. Detectives were now examining the brothers' home in Irvine, searching for evidence that might explain what had happened in Chino Hills. Because somewhere inside that house, there might be clues to the one thing investigators still couldn't answer. What turned two old acquaintances into enemies? After the shooting in Chino Hills, investigators turned their attention to the home the two brothers shared in Irvine. A search warrant was executed there as detectives tried to understand what had happened before the kidnapping and whether the attack had been planned in advance. The search was important because investigators were no longer dealing with a random encounter. They were looking at two brothers who had allegedly traveled more than 30 miles to Akebear's home, confronted him during a power outage, and forced him into the trunk of a car. Authorities have described the attack as a calculated act of violence, and the relationship between the men made the case even more complicated. Akebear and Zhengfeng Bo had known each other for years and had worked together in the Southern California real estate business. Records show that they were connected to at least two real estate LLCs, and one of the disputes investigators are examining involved a $20 million apartment complex in Pasadena. That dispute had already moved into the legal system. There were lawsuits, there were disagreements over business interests, and there were claims that money and control of the property had created serious tensions between people who had once worked together. But investigators still haven't publicly established that this dispute was the direct motive for Akebear's killing. That's an important distinction. A business conflict can explain why people stop trusting each other. It can explain why lawsuits are filed. But it doesn't automatically explain why someone would allegedly drive to another man's home, kidnap him, and ultimately shoot him. And there was another person investigators needed to understand. Yan Wenbo. Unlike his older brother Zhengfeng, Jian Quan survived the confrontation with deputies. He surrendered after the car was stopped and was subsequently charged with murder and kidnapping. He has pleaded not guilty and remains legally presumed innocent. His version of events could become extremely important. What did the brothers plan to do when they left Irvine? Did they intend to kill Akebear from the beginning? Or did something happen during the kidnapping that changed everything? And what exactly happened inside that house before the Nissan ever left Chino Hills? The answers may be hidden in the evidence investigators are now examining. Because the most disturbing possibility is that the kidnapping wasn't an impulsive act at all. It may have been planned long before Akebear ever stepped outside his home. And if that's true, the power outage that brought him to the electrical panel may have been the first move in a plan that had already been set in motion. The strangest part of this case may be that investigators still don't have a definitive answer to the simplest question. Why Sugar Akebear? Authorities have confirmed that Akebear and the Bo brothers had a previous business relationship. Investigators are now examining whether that relationship had deteriorated before the kidnapping. One of the major issues being looked at involves a $20 million apartment complex in Pasadena and disputes over loans, debts, and control of the property. According to Zhengfeng Bo's former attorney, Bo and his associates had loaned more than $2 million connected to the development. Legal disputes followed, including disagreements over who controlled the property and access to its financial records. Akebear had reportedly acted as a middleman between the parties involved. But here's where the story becomes difficult. The attorney said he had believed Akebear and Bo had a good relationship. There had apparently been no obvious public confrontation between them. No dramatic falling out that everyone knew about. No warning that something this extreme was coming. Then, on July 29th, Akebear's electricity was cut. He walked outside to check the electrical panel, and within moments, according to investigators, he had been shot and forced into the trunk of a car. That has led investigators to examine whether the power outage was deliberately created to lure him outside. If that's what happened, then someone knew where Akebear lived. They knew how to get him outside, and they were prepared to act the moment he did. But prosecutors have gone further when describing the surviving suspect's alleged involvement. Jian Quan Bo, the younger brother, has been charged with murder and kidnapping. Prosecutors say he wasn't simply an innocent passenger who happened to be in the wrong car. They allege that he knew the plan, participated in the kidnapping, and understood what was supposed to happen when the brothers went to Akebear's home. That is why prosecutors are pursuing a felony murder theory against him. Jian Quan Bo has pleaded not guilty and remains legally presumed innocent. But if prosecutors are correct, the kidnapping may, and that leaves investigators with another question. Was the financial dispute really the reason? Or was there something else between these men that nobody knew about? Because whatever happened, it turned a decades-old relationship into a deadly confrontation. And the final piece of the puzzle may be hidden in the evidence recovered from the brothers' home in Irvine. One possible explanation centers around a Pasadena apartment development worth around $20 million. Bo had invested heavily in the project and believed he had suffered major financial losses. According to people close to him, he had become increasingly frustrated about the situation and had concerns about how the investment was being handled. But there is a problem. Akebear wasn't simply some stranger connected to the property. He had been Bo's friend. They had known each other since their time in China's Xinjiang region, long before either man was living in California. They had worked together. They had built businesses together. And now, one of them was dead. The other was accused of helping kidnap him. That makes the case feel less like a random murder, and more like the final chapter of a relationship that had been deteriorating for years. But investigators still haven't publicly established exactly what happened between the men in the days and weeks before the kidnapping. There may have been arguments. There may have been financial pressure. There may have been something else entirely. And that uncertainty is what makes the case so difficult. Because on the surface, the attack appears almost impossibly extreme. Someone allegedly cut the power to Akebear's home. He came outside. He was confronted. He was shot. He was forced into a trunk. And then, during a police pursuit, he was allegedly shot again. All of this happened within a very short period of time. And when deputies finally stopped the vehicle, the situation ended with both Akebear and Zhongfeng Bo dead. The surviving brother, Jianquan Bo, now faces a murder charge and has pleaded not guilty. His account of what happened could become crucial as the case moves through court. But even if the courts eventually determine what happened that night, one mystery may remain. What made two men who had known each other for decades turn against each other so violently? Because sometimes the most disturbing mysteries aren't about strangers. They're about people who once trusted each other. And in Chino Hills, that trust appears to have ended in the trunk of a car. At the end of this bizarre case, investigators have a timeline. They know that Shooker Akebear was at his home in Chino Hills on July 29, 2026. They believe the power outage that brought him outside may have been part of the plan. They know he was allegedly shot, forced into the trunk of a car, and driven away. They know deputies pursued that vehicle, and that Zhongfeng Bo ultimately opened the trunk and fatally shot Akebear before deputies shot and killed Bo. They also know the people involved weren't strangers. Akebear and Zhongfeng Bo had known each other for decades. They had worked together in real estate, and their business interests had become entangled in lawsuits involving a multi-million-dollar Pasadena property. But people who knew Bo have said they never saw an obvious explanation for why that relationship would end in murder. And that leaves the biggest question. What actually happened between these two men? Was it really about money? Was there information that one of them discovered? Was the business dispute simply the surface of a much deeper conflict? Or was there another motive that the surviving suspect, Jianquan Bo, has been charged with murder and kidnapping and has pleaded not guilty. His account of what happened could eventually become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. For now, the case remains open. One man is dead. Another is facing a murder charge. And a 60-year-old husband and father of 3 is gone, leaving behind a family trying to understand why someone he had known for so long allegedly turned against him. Maybe the evidence recovered by investigators will eventually reveal the answer. Maybe the court proceedings will expose what happened behind the business dispute. Or maybe the real motive is still hidden somewhere in the history between these men. Because sometimes the strangest mysteries aren't about who committed the crime. Sometimes we already know who is involved. The real mystery is why. And in Chino Hills, that question remains unanswered.